The creationists' persistence, jurisprudence and God. We would like to think ourselves necessary, inevitable, ordained from all eternity. All religions, nearly all philosophies, and even part of science testify to the unwearying, heroic effort of mankind desperately denying its own contingency. Jacques Monod. Years before Nietzsche's apocalyptic announcement that God is dead, James Mill had confided to his more famous son that there is no God, but this is a family secret. Nevertheless, over 100 years later, and much like Mark Twain's obituary, the announcement that God is dead remains as premature and as controversial today as it was then. As well as being a direct onslaught on Christianity, Nietzsche's broadside was targeted at all claims to some absolute truth or authority. He maintained that the effort to fix some eternal set of values or to discover an immutable essence to mankind was not only futile but also dangerous. While the effects of that chilling obituary are felt everywhere and in every way across academe, there is still massive resistance to its challenge. This is particularly true in the world of jurists and jurisprudence. Indeed, a reader of much contemporary legal scholarship and jurisprudence could be forgiven for thinking that there is still a conspiracy of silence within the law and legal theory family. Insofar as the announcement was intended to disabuse belief in a standard of instruction or guidance in regulation of human conduct that could be drawn from outside humanity, it remains a rather dirty family secret. While lawyers and jurists profess an entirely secular undertaking and concede that law is essentially a human artifact, there is still a deep-seated reliance on the idea that it might be possible to discern some superhuman or suprahuman force, however flawed or incomplete, at work in law's doings and development. Indeed, dreams of hubris still fire the jurisprudential imagination in the hope that lawyeliness might actually become next to or on par with godliness. Despite protestations to the contrary, contemporary lawyers and legal theorists have fulfilled Nietzsche's subsequent prediction that given the way of men, there may still be caves for thousands of years in which God's shadow will be shown. Jurisprudence is one of those enclaves where such spectral deities still roam and where its practitioners still aspire to mediate divine intimations of God's design. Rather than treat God's death as an opportunity to seize the democratic initiative, some philosophers and jurists have taken it as an invitation to turn themselves into gods. Whether legal academics accept or appreciate it, legal scholarship is still enthralled to a daunting series of spectral influences that hold great sway over both the ambition and achievement of its most celebrated practitioners. In an important sense, jurisprudence, put simply, those efforts to step back from the actual practice and operation of law in order to make some general sense of it all, is where such ghostly tendencies are most frequently cited, often invoked, and occasionally exorcised. Jurists strive to reduce law's sprawling and contingent complexities to a simple and singular sense of order and coherence. If it is far too gauche for jurists to contend that God has a visible hand in this process, they are unable to resist the quasi-divinistic urge, as Holmes put it, to catch an echo of the infinite, a glimpse of its unfathomable process, a hint of the universal law. There is something persistently mystical and almost Kabbalistic about jurists' continuing belief that there is some deep, subtle, and organizing force at work in the common law's development. Within this philosophical account, law always manages to be more than the historical heap of its human-made parts. It is a qualitative force that transcends its quantitative mass. Judges and jurists are portrayed as being involved in the almost theological task of illuminating the transcendent wonders of human-made law with the intellectual lightning of jurisprudential insight. This influence is as strong and baneful today as it ever was. Although the jurists phrase their analysis in evolutionary terms, the link to Soapy Sam and his creationist acolytes should be obvious. Many jurists are creationist wolves in evolutionist sheep's clothing. Like their religious cousins, contemporary jurists do not rely on some legal equivalent of the Genesis story to explain the common law. Instead, they see a force at work that is more detached and distant. Its presence is no less profound and irreducible for that. Jurisprudence remains caught in the hold of this precious mentality from the most doctrinal of legal scholarship through to the most abstruse of legal theorizing. Nevertheless, there is likely no coherent truth or objective integrity that inheres and endures in the heavens, humanity's essential nature, or the general legal scheme of things. Furthermore, if there is, it most certainly cannot be divined from the erstwhile musings of jurists and judges across space and time. As a thoroughly human and thus flawed artifact, law is a hodgepodge of the good and the bad, the useful and the useless, the enduring and the ephemeral. If lawyers and jurists are to help society make good on itself, they must surely resist the temptation to pay homage to the dubious deities of truth and objectivity. Of course, these fundamental charges are not applicable to all legal scholars. However, as rich and as vibrant as it is, the critical literature remains marginal and underlines the prevalence of the traditional model. Accordingly, in this chapter, I first outline the different forms that creationism has taken and place Bishop Wilberforce's contribution in a more contemporary context. In the second section I examine the black-letter tradition in law and reveal its deeper theological resonances. In the third section, I concentrate on the influential writings of the leading legal Wilberforcean, Ronald Dawkin, and display their continuing attachment to the dubious virtues of abstraction and scholasticism. In the fourth section, I take something of a philosophical detour and unearth some of the problematic philosophical foundations that underlie the creationist project in law. Finally, I canvass the politics of essentialist theories of the common law and suggest a limited way in which rational design might retain a semblance of jurisprudential legitimacy. Like some biologists, legal theorists have not been able to give up the supernatural claim that there is some force beyond nature and themselves that is orchestrating the parochial efforts of the legal community. In conclusion, I substantiate the charge that, if you scratch many evolutionary jurists, they so often bleed a theology of miraculous design. All things bright and beautiful. Charles Darwin went to Christ's College at Cambridge University in 1827. He stayed in the same rooms that the former student and fellow, William Paley, had 50 years before. Although there is no reason to think that this was more than a matter of curious coincidence, the lives of the two men share a certain perverse synchronicity. In completing his degree, the young Darwin was obliged to study Paley's extensive writings. A theological scholar of some repute, Paley had been an eloquent proponent of the so-called argument by design rejection of evolution. Paley's central contention was that the sheer complexity of biological organisms, especially humans, defied explanation as being the result of chance evolution rather than deliberate design. He asked his readers to suppose that, in crossing a heath, they had come across a stone. If asked how the stone came to be there, a reasonable answer might be that it had been there forever. However, if the reader had come across a watch, a similar answer would be unlikely and unconvincing. Paley contended that, in the same way that the watch's integrated complexity and perfected functionality was the result of its creation by a highly intelligent designer, so the even more complex and functional properties of natural organisms must also have been created by an even higher intelligence. As it was too fantastical to imagine that such universal order and beauty could have occurred almost serendipitously across time, Paley was drawn to the seemingly inevitable conclusion that the marks of design are too strong to be got over. Design must have a designer. That designer must have been a person. That person is God. The elegant force of this simple claim attracted much support at the time and still manages to capture many evolutionists' attention. Indeed, so taken was Darwin by Paley's work that he spent much of his life demonstrating why Paley's claims were false and that even the most complex of biological creatures or designs required no designing hand or orchestrating intent. Nevertheless, Paley's design thesis remains attractive to today's creationists and others. In the continuing evolutionary quarrel, the guises may have changed and the arguments might be more scientifically sophisticated, but the evolutionists' and creationists' essential moves remain much the same as in Soapy Sam's days. There is a strong and vocal minority of protagonists who offer a tantalizing blend of science and cryptotheology. Explicitly relying on the Victorian notion of providential design, they contend that the Earth's unique fitness for carbon-based life generally and human beings particularly is not the result of contingent or coincidental circumstances. It is the designed and inevitable outcome of a cosmic plan. It is accepted that all the cosmic activity over the billions of years from primeval swamps to postmodern conurbations is specifically directed and designed to produce the kind of intelligent life that presently exists, namely Homo sapiens. In maintaining that life's being is also part of a design for life's becoming, it is a bold and clever thesis that emphasizes the seamless, harmonious, and teleological basis of all phenomena's development and sophistication in line with a series of natural laws. Science has revealed a universe stamped in every corner, riven in every detail, with an overwhelmingly and all-pervasive biocentric and anthropocentric design. However, these offerings put forward little scientific support for such radical conclusion. Their accounts are based as much on awe as argument and tend to rely on faith as much as analysis. Indeed, this modern reworking of old ideas makes some colossal and unsubstantiated leaps from is to ought and from appearance to reality. While masquerading as cutting-edge scientists, these latter-days Paleys and Wilberforces are committed to transforming evolutionary biology from a purely historical study to a logic-based system and, in the process, to defending the inevitable and moral force of the status quo. It is more akin to political ideology than scientific inquiry. Evolutionary biology can only help fix where life has been, not where it is going. Humanity does not evolve toward anything, but only away from something. In contrast, The creationists flip-flop between a scientific gambit and a religious strategy as best fits their present needs or predicament. They challenge the scientific basis of Darwinian evolution or claim that it is no less a religion than a fundamentalist Protestantism. They argue that Darwinianism is unsubstantiated on the facts, ill-conceived as scientific method, and mischievously biased. Moreover, mindful that available evidence of events over billions of years is limited and impressionistic, they insist that their own approach is as plausible as any other and that ultimately Darwinians fall back on intellectual faith as much as demonstrable proof. Concentrated mainly in the United States, there is still a huge number of people who believe in a Genesis-inspired account of nature's origins, and the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground, and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul, in which the earth and its current life forms were created by God at some time much more recent, usually Archbishop of Armagh James Eustace's computation of October 23, 4004 BC, than the 4.5 billion years claimed by scientists. At their most confident, they propose that there is an abstract permanence to all creation and that species were made for a preordained purpose. With humans standing at the head of a divine chain of being, there may have been some minor variations through microevolution but no Darwinian-style macroevolution. At their more conciliatory, the creationists adopt a less revelatory and more analytical demeanor, exploiting gaps and uncertainties in the fossil record. They suggest that God is to be found in the details of so-called intelligent design that characterize evolution and whose purpose and direction are divine but unknowable. When presented in such a modest form, the creationist argument tends to hover at the very edge of theology and, with God taking on a decidedly human guise, to merge with the more ambitious efforts of secular scientists who talk only of design, not deities. The polarized framing of the debate leaves little room for those who wish to accept evolution entirely and still hold on to a religious faith. Indeed, Darwin himself can be understood in such terms. While his work might imply a thoroughgoing rejection of any form of divine presence or godly involvement, he avoided taking any definitive stance. Along with his Victorian values, Darwin's love of his devout wife, Emma, prevented him from vigorously pursuing the idea that there was no God. While he had lost his own faith on the death of his young daughter, he constantly tried to reconcile faith and science or, at least, not to render the two entirely incompatible. Of course, some would say that this effort to combine evolution and God was not religion at all. It is as much a part of the problem as anything else. Indeed, this is exactly what Philip Johnson, who is incidentally a law professor, asserts. The acceptance of naturalistic assumptions in science by Christian and secular intellectuals alike has moved God steadily into some remote never-never land, before the Big Bang, or even out of reality altogether. While most of his anti-evolutionist defense of creationism is fairly standard fare and makes the predictable critical moves about speciation, fossil gaps, and bewildering complexity, he does add a more subtle but no less flawed argument to the creationist canon. A devout Christian and as much against Paleontologian design theory as any Darwinian devotee, Johnson maintains that, as there is an all-knowing and all-caring God who is involved in all the personal details of daily living, science should be interested in that fact if it claims to be concerned with providing a complete account of the physical world, including its basic properties and their causal relations. In a relatively sophisticated account, he contends that science is premised on a philosophical naturalism that only allows for natural explanations and, therefore, is fundamentally atheistic. This is said to be antithetical to science's claim that it is agnostic on such matters as the existence of God and the nature of good and evil. Because this is an argument based on faith, particularly the unquestioned authority of the biblical text and the indisputable existence of God, Johnson and other like-minded creationists are unlikely to be vanquished by rational argument or scientific proof. Theirs is a belief based on religious faith, which, by definition, is not susceptible to logical debunking. It assumes exactly that which is contested and to be proved, the existence of a supreme or supervising God. In so many ways, the good bishop would still have felt relatively at home in the contemporary debate. Samuel Wilberforce was a man in and a child of the Victorian age. Born in 1805 to the renowned and influential anti-slavery politician, William Wilberforce, he was a precocious talent. Having earned a first class in mathematics and a second class in classics at Oxford, he entered the clergy and was ordained as a Church of England vicar in 1829. By the time of the Oxford debate in 1870, he had matured into a leading religious and intellectual figure of the day, having been Bishop of Oxford for 25 years. During his tenure, Wilberforce made it his professional and personal mission to unify the fracturing church and head off the increasing threat of the Catholic Church. Gifted with rare intellectual eloquence and an enviable popular charm, Wilberforce managed to sermonize the laity into improved observance and to become the very model of the hard-working churchman. However, His achievements were not simply those of the consummate leader and charismatic organizer. He possessed a genuine religious devotion and believed to the end of his life in 1873 that, despite desertions by his family to Catholicism, God had not forsaken him in his true Anglican faith. His involvement in the Oxford debate was typical. In his lifelong struggle to secure Church of England's place and values in the burgeoning British world, he saw the exchange with the diligent Huxley as simply one more battle to be won in a many-sided war. For Wilberforce, the significance of Darwin's thesis itself was relatively marginal. Indeed, while the Oxford debate piqued Wilberforce's intellectual curiosity, it is hardly mentioned in the various biographies of him. For instance, Standish Meacham framed Wilberforce's contribution to the debate in terms of the broader tension between the established church and contemporary science. It would be wrong, he insisted, to argue the truth or falsehood of the theory on religious grounds. But this does not make it the less important to point out on scientific grounds scientific errors, when those errors tend to limit God's glory in creation, or to gainsay the revealed relations of that creation to himself. Far more distressing, Darwin had suggested that man himself was only a part of this long evolutionary chain, thereby reducing him to the level of a beast. Free will, reason, redemption, the eternal spirit, all these attributes a Christian must attach to man's nature if he is to believe and to partake in God's glorious plan for his salvation. All are equally and utterly irreconcilable with the degrading notion of a brute origin of him who was created in the image of God and redeemed by the eternal Son, assuring to himself his nature. Evolution and natural selection took from God his omnipotence and from man those divine attributes God had willed him. Far from reflecting God's design, nature moved at the behest of chance. Random accident denied divine purpose. In taking such a stance, Wilberforce was by no means out on a limb. He was taking a stand that had not only a proven heritage in religious circles but also considerable support in the scientific community. He had no sympathy for a literalist account of Genesis in which creation is seen as a swift and complete six-day task by an all-doing creator. Echoing the powerful ideas of William Paley, the bishop defends the previous existence of an intelligent designer who, being wise and all-powerful, put into effect the highest conceivable rule of regularity and order, which resulted in regular progression from the less to the more highly organized. In this respect, Wilberforce's views were more sophisticated and informed than much of the so-called creationist lobby today. He recognized the cogent force of much scientific work in establishing the evolution of the existing world over deep geological time, but he refused to believe that this had occurred without God's intention and to his greater glory. Indeed, although Wilberforce's views are often caricatured as quaintly Victorian in their style and provenance, their general force is still a very powerful current in contemporary debate almost 150 years later. If Wilberforce were to be reincarnated, he would likely be surprised, and slightly pleased, by the fact that the scientific wave has not submerged all beneath it. The creationist gambit remains a strong and popular one, particularly in the United States. Indeed, as I demonstrate next, it is the intellectual heirs to Paley and Wilberforce that still manage to dominate contemporary jurisprudence. Such jurists tend to be weak creationists, in that they do not posit a divine purpose but instead identify purposes in the nature of legal things themselves. Law becomes more than an accumulation of individual human actions, and its coordination and coherence over time is sustained by some supernatural or superhuman force. Paint it black. Much legal scholarship continues to operate within the cramping and pervasive spirit of a black-letter mentality. By this, I mean the tendency of lawyers to focus almost exclusively on formal material in a way that rarely gets beyond a taxonomic stock-taking. Originally a typographical term, black-letter law was used to refer to rudimentary principles that were printed in boldface type in traditional law texts. However, it has come to designate an approach to law that claims to concentrate on narrow statements of what the law is and eschews resort to any extra doctrinal considerations of policy or context. The textual formulation of the law is regnant and is treated as a world unto itself. In scholarly terms, the limited aim of black-letterism is to identify, analyze, organize, and synthesize extant rules into a coherent and integrated whole. There is much talk of A's and B's in illustrative exegesis with almost no reference to political context or social identity. Fostering jurisprudence as an inward-looking and self-contained discipline, law is treated as a world of its own that is separate from the society within which it operates and purports to serve. Criticism is largely confined to highlighting formal inconsistencies and rooting out logical error. This organizational function is seen as an end in itself, with the corollary that any study of the social or political context in which those rules arise or have effect is considered, at best, to be someone else's jurisdiction, like the social scientists or political theorists. It is not that such work is unimportant, but that it is not a necessary part of the lawyer's learning or expertise. In a manner of speaking, the ghosts of Blackstone and Coke not only prowl the corridors of academe but are welcome souls in its offices and classrooms. Although mainstream scholars feign a modesty and subservience to law, their work smacks of a hubris that is no less acceptable for its more humble presentation. In undertaking such a black-letter task, the ambition of the scholar is to collate the available cases and materials and then whip recalcitrant areas into conceptual shape. At its most sophisticated, there is an insistence that the common law is much more than the sum of its precedential parts. The precedents are not the law, only evidence and illustrations of it. The informing assumption is that what the courts are doing is largely right. Jurisprudence is the rational science of general and extensive principles, and the common law is fraught with the accumulated wisdom of the ages. In short, it is taken for granted that legal doctrine is underpinned by an intelligible and just plan of social life, such that the task of the legal scholar is to extend law in accordance with the plan so that it becomes less fragmentary and more intelligible. This tradition of blackletterism runs from Coke, Hale, and Blackstone through Dicey, Pollock, and Anson to Smith, Tritell, and Beatson. It remains as alive and kicking today as it ever has been. A cursory glance at the leading English textbooks strongly supports such an assessment. Smith and Hogan's Criminal Law, Cheshire and Firmston's Contract, and Winfield's Tort all speak to the narrow and precious approach to legal scholarship that dominates legal study. The ambition is to provide a comprehensive and systemic account of the law. Any criticism is about discrete errors and particular mistakes rather than any systematic shortcomings. Almost without exception, these authors tend to be male. For instance, Smith and Hogan offer a large tome that is purely about conceptual analysis, whose main task is a descriptive account of the law and in which principled consistency within judgments, areas, and between areas is the organizing device. There is no contextual setting offered about crime or its informing forces, with readers being asked to judge for himself how far these, the stated purposes of criminal law, are fulfilled by English criminal law. This black-letter literature is not without its jurisprudential champions. Although black-letter law resists larger theoretical concerns and infiltrations, it has been defended in theoretical terms. In a wide-ranging essay, Peter Burks argues that traditional legal literature has played a massive role in the modern development of the common law and is the perfect theoretical complement to the common law's more casuistic practice. Defending the canon of legal literature, he acknowledges great academics as much as great judges, lawyers, and cases as the fixed points in the common law. Burks is very clear that what is great is to be assessed by the extent to which a work contributes to the search for principle, rationally organizes the case law, and is able to advance the magic of the common law in its capacity to achieve sensitive pragmatic change without sacrificing structured rationality and predictability. Accordingly, black-letter law is not simply the product of academic practitioners who are unable or cannot be bothered to engage in a broader and different intellectual exercise. It results from the noble efforts of those who undertake such a task as a matter of principle and pride. These scholars do not so much reject the Blackstonian influence as embrace it in a less grandiose and more focused incarnation. Nevertheless, modesty is no excuse and humility is no escape from the shortcomings of its full-blown exercise. It is such a full-blown exercise that contemporary jurisprudence has become. Herbert Hart served the legal community of black-letter scholars well. His enlightened brand of legal positivism in the concept of law, with its analytical emphasis on rules, regularity, and reasonableness, provided a jurisprudential support that enabled black-letter writers to continue with their academic craft without too many qualms about the legitimacy or efficacy of their work. This is not surprising, as Hart's avowed aim was to provide an essay in descriptive sociology in that he sought to make sense of lawyers' daily practices. He offered a commentary rather than critique. While this garnered obvious support among the adherents to a black-letter approach, it did little to convince skeptics or critics. Many jurists began to suggest that Hart's ideas ran out of steam at the very point that they were most needed. They had little to say about the resolution of hard cases, where rules are unclear or clashed, other than that judges had a discretion and responsibility to do the best they could. While this gave comfort to the critics, who tried to use this opening as a way to establish and further the claim that law is politics, others were convinced that, while law is a system of rules, it is not only that. Law is about values as much as it is about rules. These naturalist jurists were dismissive of black-letter scholarship. It was considered to be too limited, unduly isolated, and even woefully inadequate. Accordingly, a new generation of jurists began to develop a theory of law that took account of law as a thoroughly political enterprise. Perhaps as a way to balance this excursion into the realm of values and morals, there was a felt need to become ever more abstract and formal in the hope that this would insulate the resulting theories from charges of partisanship. In this effort, the traditional impulse to abstract organization and formal coherence proved irresistible. However, this explicitly theoretical strain of legal scholarship criticizes the textbook tradition from within the same disciplinary mindset. Whatever its claims to the contrary, mainstream jurisprudence implicitly alleges that the ambition of black-letter scholarship is correct, but that its focus and execution are severely at fault. Thus, jurists have dislodged black-letter law only to replace it with black-letter theory. Blackstonian commitments have come out of the closet and become a celebrated ideal, not an embarrassing corollary of legal scholarship. As traditionally understood, jurisprudence applies to all those efforts to step back from the actual practice and operation of law in order to make some general sense of it all. As Carl Llewellyn phrased it, jurisprudence is as big as law, and bigger. This venture can be carried out from all manner of perspectives and indeed has been. Economists, sociologists, literary critics, anthropologists, political scientists, psychologists, and many others have sought to place the world of law under closer critical scrutiny. However, in recent years, jurisprudence has been hijacked by philosophers. Apart from their usual imperialist claims about philosophy being the intellectual discipline that is assumed and incorporated by all others, legal philosophers claim to be first among jurisprudential equals. They insist that, while there is much of value to be learned about law when viewed from the outside as a social or political activity, the effort to understand law in its own terms and as a viable internal operation is entitled to theoretical priority. It is not so much that they dismiss other types of study, but that they claim that they are of a secondary and derivative importance to lawyers. While such jurists concede that not all problems and issues in law are philosophical, they do contend that all those problems and issues are capable of becoming philosophical ones and that they are premised on some inescapable philosophical assumptions. Construed in this way, jurisprudence soon found itself on the familiar terrain of many traditional philosophical conundrums and, in the process, has become dominated by philosophical preoccupations. Mindful of law's black-letter tradition and the challenge of maintaining democratic legitimacy for courts in a society in which important social questions are routinely left to judicial resolution, jurists have considered a central part of the jurisprudential project to develop an epistemology of law. How is it possible to have knowledge about law or to know what counts as knowledge of or about law? What counts as good and bad knowledge about law? Jurisprudence has adopted a traditional and philosophical stance in developing a series of truth claims about the legal enterprise. All the problems of legal philosophy or jurisprudence have tended to begin and, in some cases, to end with this inquiry. Most of the important arguments in legal thought are epistemological in nature. What begins as a preliminary condition for any jurisprudential progress or enlightenment to be made soon becomes, once achieved, a way to underwrite the particular intervention as universally valid and, therefore, superior to all other offerings. Ironically, the jurisprudential attention to values has resulted in a turn away from the world rather than a return to it. Legal theorists have come to subscribe to a greater or lesser degree to the Blackstonian cause in which rigor, sweep, form, consistency, and integrity are the watchwords. Matters of material or substantive justice are treated as distinctly secondary. Although this way of presenting the ambition and agenda of jurisprudence seems to speak in the mystical tones of bygone days, it remains the implicit mission and mindset of modern jurisprudence. Mainstream jurists seem united in their belief that law is more than the sum total of extant laws and decisions. It is felt to be both the expression and repository of a political insight that transcends the bounds of its temporary articulation. In this way, it is generally agreed that popular lawmaking cannot be left entirely to its own promptings but must be judged by its willingness to conform to the dictates of a loftier discipline. Consequently, legal theorists strive to explain and justify the delicate, and elusive, relation between law's immanence, the idea of law as the rational embodiment of an indwelling harmony, and law's instrumentality, the practice of using law as an institutional tool for social problems. In searching for that balance, the cool detachment of philosophical reflection is considered more conducive to democratic advancement than the heated contestability of popular debate over localized justice. Despite the regular incantation of the Homesian wisdom that the life of the law has not been logic, but experience, what counts as experience is limited to law's own workings and lawyers' own wiles. Moreover, the jurisprudential examination of that experience is abstract and logical. In an important sense, modern jurists are still held captive to one of the most enduring tropes in common law history, Lord Mansfield's stricture that the law is constantly working on and through itself to satisfy better its own self-transforming ambitions. In a relatively unimportant chancery case about testimonial competence, he concluded that a statute very seldom can take in all cases, therefore the common law, that works itself pure by rules drawn from the fountain of justice, is for that reason superior to an act of parliament. Always travelling, but never arriving, The common law is portrayed as continuing process that fulfills and refreshes itself from its own self-generated resources. If lawliness is not next to godliness, it is at least a quasi-divine enterprise of purity and great design. Law's destiny. The leading so-called purist among the elite of modern jurisprudence is Ronald Dawkin. He has placed the notion that the law works itself pure at the dynamic core of his legal theory. Over 3 decades, Dawkin has developed a constructivist theory of law and adjudication, at the heart of which is the naturalist insistence that law is deeply and thoroughly political. The general sweep of Dawkin's jurisprudence is too familiar to warrant another full or detailed rehearsal. Accordingly, my introduction to his ideas and claims concentrates on the basic philosophical commitments that inform and animate his jurisprudential offerings. Although there have been several twists and turns over the past couple of decades, the central themes and ambitions of Dawkin's writings remain remarkably clear and consistent. Law is a moral practice, intellectual coherence is a primary value, and there are right answers to legal controversies. Blooded, but unbowed, Dawkin remains as defiant and as unapologetic as ever in defending these basic philosophical commitments. From a Darwinian perspective, he is a distant cousin to Soapy Sam, the juristic heir apparent to the creationist tradition of evolutionary thinking. Conflict is at the heart of the law. It is its animating force as well as its operating focus. In dealing with the conflicts represented by litigation, lawyers and judges are conflicted over not only what is the correct resolution of any particular conflict, but also what is the correct method by which to arrive at the correct resolution. For Dawkin, it is this underlying conflict about legal reasoning that forms the raison d'etre of jurisprudence. He is interested in the theoretical disagreement over the grounds of law, namely, under what circumstances should particular propositions of law be taken to be sound or true. While jurists may disagree over what those propositions are and how one identifies them, there is widespread agreement about the fact that there are some standards that determine what propositions of law are true and sound. Accordingly, Dawkin wants to provide a theory of law that will tell judges what it is that they are supposed to be doing when resolving competing accounts about what decision to make in any particular case. To do this, Dawkin argues that, while the disagreement appears to be about what the law is, it is really a disagreement about what the law should be. For Dawkin, therefore, jurisprudence concerns arguments over whether and why propositions of law can be controversial. What is most important is that this challenge is concentrated on the internal viewpoint of participants. Jurisprudence tries to grasp the argumentative character of our legal practice by joining that practice and struggling with the issues of soundness and truth participants face. It is not that other external inquiries are invalid or useless, only that they do not amount to jurisprudence proper. Consequently, Dawkin concludes that propositions of law are true if they figure in or follow from the principles of justice, fairness and procedural due process that provide the best constructive interpretation of the community's legal practice. Under Dawkin's approach, therefore, any true and sound account of law is also a political account of the best moral practice that law can be. He denies that a valid jurisprudential account is simply a matter of providing an accurate historical description of what the courts have done in the past, as this leaves judges with no legal basis to evaluate past practice and no legal guidance when the past is silent on the controversy in hand. He further rejects it as making an accurate prediction of what the courts will do in the future, as this fails to take legal reasoning seriously and offers no moral purchase on the course that the law should take. Rather, Dawkin offers an account of law and adjudication that is as much about moral principles as it is about legal tradition. Nevertheless, although he treats law and justice as intimately connected, he insists that it is incumbent upon judges to treat the legal past as important for its own sake, because law as integrity supposes that people are entitled to a coherent and principled extension of past political decisions even when judges profoundly disagree about what this means. Therefore, the common law judge is required to apply the law dutifully, deferentially, and reliably to present cases. In this way, Dawkin advances an understanding of adjudication as a political practice that works the space between law's institutional past and its future possibilities. While the better interpretation is not necessarily one that accounts for the most decisions, the settled body of legal norms and justifications is claimed to be the motor force of principled adjudication. Law's attitude aims, in the interpretive spirit, to lay principle over practice to show the best route to a better future, keeping the right faith with the past. In short, Dawkin maintains that the judges should treat the law as if it were a seamless web, providing complete and determinate guidance on all legal disputes. There is no need or justification to leave the law behind and engage in unconstrained ideological choice. Instead, judges are charged with treating the accumulation of legal decisions as fragments of an intelligible, if latent or implicit, plan of social life and, having elucidated those deeper ideals, to extend law in principled manner so that it becomes less fragmentary and more integrated, insisting that it is not only sensible but necessary to talk about the truth claims of law. Dawkin maintains that there are true and false legal answers to particular disputes and that such answers can only be arrived at by the judicial application of a suitably philosophical method. For Dawkin, there is a legal truth to the matter. While Dawkin is uncompromising in his claim that adjudication is an inevitable exercise in moral judgment, he is equally forceful that this does not mean that legal decisions are nothing more than the judge's moral views are legal or that legal justice is coterminous with judges' ideas of justice. Although judges' moral views will influence the common law's development and judges are encouraged to be wide-ranging and imaginative in their search for coherence with fundamental principle, there are limits to how much and how far judges can rely on their own sense of justice. There is a definite and genuine difference between law as a public institution and morality as a personal commitment, because judges' central obligation is that of general fidelity to law and the brute facts of legal history. Limit the role any judge's personal convictions of justice can play in his decisions. Dawkin's Hercules or any judge is duty-bound to uphold the wisdom of the past, albeit in imaginative and innovative ways. Anyone who accepts law as integrity must accept that the actual political history of his community will sometimes check his other political convictions in his overall interpretive judgment. Moreover, these same restraints ensure that jurists, including Dawkin himself, do not get away with offering a moral reading of the law that is only a thinly veiled version of their own preferred moral stance. While Dawkin is unrelenting in his assertion that telling it how it is means, up to a point, telling it how it should be, it is the up to a point that establishes the crucial space between valid legal interpretation and invalid personal moralizing. Although judges and jurists will disagree over where that point is exactly, they are obliged to recognize its necessary existence and limiting force. In the Dawkinian scheme of things, therefore, judges attain institutional success, professional esteem, and intellectual satisfaction by engaging in this demanding theoretical effort rather than by bringing it to some preordained conclusion. That judges do not agree on what the right answer is in any particular case is not a problem as long as they can agree that there is, at least theoretically, a right answer out there. How far judges travel on their so-called justificatory ascent before they are satisfied that they have achieved a workable account of the law as a principled moral practice or until their theoretical resources no longer function adequately will be for each judge to determine. Notwithstanding the different capabilities of individual judges, it is the objective pursuit of truth through reason that is the hallmark of valid adjudication. It is only by adopting such an approach that judges will stand any chance of playing their designated part in societies, which are deeply divided in their politics and morality. We cannot pursue that indispensable ambition, of living together as equals, unless we undertake, when necessary, to ascend high enough in our collective deliberations, including our adjudicative deliberations, to test our progress in ensuring that the principles under which we are governed treat us as equals. This amounts to a Blackstonian imperative with a political conscience and a democratic mandate. As such, it is a tempting and tantalizing prospect. Nevertheless, in his classical efforts to continue through renovation the Blackstonian tradition, Dawkin has not managed to overcome its debilitating difficulties and drawbacks. Moreover, in presenting a more sophisticated theoretical project than his predecessors, he seems to have added a few more problems of his own. All in all, Dawkin's jurisprudence has condemned common law judges and lawyers to a practical task that is more Sisyphean than Herculean. They are doomed to pursue an ambition that becomes ever more out of reach as jurists appear to move ever closer to its grasping. In his more recent work, Dawkin has not only held firm to these basic convictions but has confirmed them in the most unequivocal terms. In determining the correct legal answer to particular discrete legal problems, he still maintains that it is incumbent upon judges to have reflected on the whole system of moral and legal principles that comprise a particular area of law and to grasp them in their most coherent and appealing presentation. Consequently, Dawkinian judges are obliged to take a theory-drenched approach, even though they might well disagree over what that theory is and how it applies to the dispute at hand. As Dawkin expresses it, a claim of law is tantamount to the claim, then, that one principle or another provides a better justification of some part of legal practice. Better in what way? Better interpretively, better, that is, because it fits the legal practice better, and puts it in a better light. In that case, any legal argument is vulnerable to what we might call justificatory assent. When we raise our eyes a bit from the particular cases that seem most on point immediately, and look at neighboring areas of the law, or maybe even raise our eyes quite a bit and look in general, say, to accident law more generally, or to constitutional law more generally, or to our assumptions about judicial competence or responsibility more generally, we may find a serious threat to our claim that the principle we were about to endorse allows us to see our legal practices in their best light. For Dawkin, therefore, adjudication is less a technical craft and more a philosophical adventure of the grandest kind in which formal integrity and abstract coherence are both its tools and their goal. Nevertheless, Dawkin concedes that not every judge has the necessary Herculean philosophical wherewithal to undertake such an ambitious challenge. Whereas a mythical Herculean judge might be able to master the arcane equipment of philosophical sophistication, synthesize all the available historical material, construct a perfectly attuned and all-embracing structure, and apply it consistently to detailed legal problems, this is far beyond the competence of merely earthly beings. Instead, what is important is that judges should do the best that they can by being prepared to enter the justificatory ascent that might draw them into a more theoretical argument than they originally anticipated or wanted. Dawkin does not expect judges to make that justificatory ascent as a matter of course, but he does remind judges and jurists that the ladder of theoretical ascent is always there, on the cards, even when no one is tempted to take even the first step up it. Dawkin maintains that reflective height is the guarantor of moral depth. At the very least, within the Dawkinian scheme of things, formal consistency with the law's own overarching principles is as important as substantive or local justice on any particular issue. A philosophical excursus. Of course, this grand style of legal philosophy has not gone unchallenged. It has come in for stern rebuke. Critics condemn such scholarly efforts in which jurists not only seem to believe that law has a supernatural or suprahistorical life, but that it can be known and understood. The idea that law is an immanent whole that transcends the accumulated sum of its immediate parts and that there is a simple metaphysical formula that explains all law or that legal practice can be rendered philosophically pure is increasingly untenable in a world in which lawyers and society at large are increasingly diverse in composition, interests, and objectives. The value claim that the best way to provide solid and secure footings for law and legal theory is by becoming more and more removed and abstracted from its day-to-day operation is deeply mistaken. There are no solid and secure footings for law and legal theory that are not themselves part of the very political and situated debate that they are intended to ground and underwrite. There is no escape from the messy and contingent facts of social living. Despite the wishes of contemporary jurists, there is no difference in character or authority that distinguishes philosophical or jurisprudential debate from any other kind of debate. The standards used for judging the merits of particular arguments are part of the debate, not apart from it. While the standards will vary from one arena of debate to another, that is, the standards for aesthetic appreciation will not be the same as those for moral judgment, and while there will be a constant hankering after more compelling or objective standards, there are none. There is no difference between what we honestly believe to be right or the case and what actually is right or the case. The belief that there is such a difference is simply one more belief. It is to a further elaboration of those broad critical claims that I now turn, especially as they apply to the debate over the evolutionary character of legal development and the creation by design approach. Instead of reveling in the full amplitude and unbuttoned possibilities of human existence, jurists bring to it a narrow and smothering perspective. Wanting to reduce everything down to a dry and bloodless endeavor, they resemble taxidermists rather than naturalists. They want to capture and display legal wildlife in museums rather than marvel at its living color and glorious vitality. Under this tutelage, jurisprudence is less about awe and splendor and more about rigor and scrupulousness. Although they present their work in grand and confident terms, contemporary jurists are fearful and desperate. They are fearful that, if the activities of law and lawyers are not held in check, they will decline into a chaotic arbitrariness. They are desperate because their efforts to establish such a checking device are increasingly less convincing. Rather than celebrate society's diversity and energy, they wish to leash and corral them. Accordingly, in its efforts to rescue law and lawyers from themselves, jurisprudence craves greater theoretical authority not only to bolster individual contributions but also to salvage its own waning prestige. This characteristic mix of conceit and timidity is held together by a commitment to the idea that there are certain moral and legal facts of the matter that transcend and discipline the beliefs of its participants about what the legal enterprise is and is not about. Maintaining that there are right methods that will produce right results, these jurists claim to speak with the authoritative accent of truth and objectivity. On closer inspection, though, these methodological claims are less the imprimaturs of a formalized justice and more the earnest ways of simply getting by. This is no bad thing. Stripped of their philosophical paraphernalia, these jurisprudential accounts might still have something to offer law in its task of being substantively just in a constantly shifting and changing world. But this paraphernalia must go. The insistence that the theoretical effort to distinguish between what the world seems like to us and what the world really is will pay practical dividends must be abandoned. There is no worthwhile or sustainable distinction between what is thought to be the case about the world and what is the case about the world, and about what seems to be right and what is right. Despite philosophers' and jurists' best efforts, it is impossible to demonstrate that there is some critical distance between the world and our thoughts about it such that the world cannot only be what people think it is. To say something true and objective about the world is to do no more than report on what people presently believe or accept to be true and objective about the world. This is not deny that there is a reality or to fall into some absurdly solipsistic understanding of the world. It is simply to accept that there is no way of stepping outside our perceptions about the world in order to determine whether those perceptions correspond with what is really the case. The critical idea that a theory of truth is a theory of meaning and no more is offered as an explanation of what people do, rather than of a non-causal, representing relation in which they stand to non-human entities. There is no truth about what is really there over and above what are treated as the best prevailing beliefs about what is really there. What is best is whatever has managed to get itself accepted in the relevant community of inquiry. Of course, many contemporary jurists do not insist that there are facts of the matter, such that what is the case or right is entirely independent of what is thought to be the case or right. So-called realists are few and far between. Instead, these constructivists deny the existence of any moral facts as something independent of beliefs. They recognize that truths are as much chosen as they are perceived, opting for an account that treats what people would think of as right under ideal conditions to determine what is in fact right. They have traded in notions of fundamental objectivity for more modest notions of constrained objectivity. What they lose in universality, they hope to gain in relevance and credibility. To achieve this more restrained fulfillment of the philosophical project, the most popular strategy has been to keep the truth question separate from the reality question by providing an account of truth and objectivity that does not depend on there being a correspondence between what is thought to be the case about the world and what is the case about the world. Denying the realists' insistence on moral facts of the matter, or, at least, their accessibility to human demonstrations, they recognize that truth is caught within the social web of language. However, they go beyond the simplistic and uninteresting claims of correspondence theorists who deliver only empty tautologies about practice and objectivity. Instead, they offer a so-called coherence account of truth and objectivity in which it is maintained that the most convincing account is the one that shows how a complex structure of relationships can best cohere. This means that the truth of any particular moral judgment is dependent on its coherence with all other moral intuitions and claims. In contrast to axiomatic or linear theories that establish first principles and then argue deductively from them to more detailed and particularized moral judgments, coherence accounts engage in a continual process of adjustment and revision between general moral principles and particular moral judgments until the most balanced and harmonized account is constructed. Nevertheless, despite their constructivist claims, most philosophers still manage to utilize realist heirlooms as part of modern theorizing rather than shelve them as historical curiosities. Although they accept that what is thought to be the case is related to what is the case or that moral beliefs are relevant to moral facts of the matter, they do not concede that there are no moral facts of the matter. It is more a question of accessibility than actuality. The motivating fear is that, if the attempt to demand what is true and denounce what is false is abandoned, efforts to distinguish right and wrong will also be hopeless and all moral claims will be relativized. Thus, each opinion, no matter how quirky or perverse, will merit equal attention. In such circumstances, it is dreaded that morality will be reduced to a crude triumph of might over right or, at best, the tyranny of the majority. Accordingly, modern philosophers do not insist that it must be possible to demonstrate that a statement is true, only that it can be true or would be true under ideal conditions. The truth of a statement is not entirely reducible to or completely settled by reference to extant practice or the accumulation of prevailing beliefs. The tendency, therefore, is to offer largely constructivist accounts, but to insist that there are limits on that enterprise and to bound it by some strong and realist-grounded claims about morality. It is a tacit acknowledgement that coherence alone will not guarantee justice or fairness. Coherence only works as a guarantor of truth and objectivity when the general orientation of a set of practices is basically just. Whether apartheid or Nazism were wrong will not be determined by their greater or lesser compliance with the demands of coherence, but by their basic commitments and substantive consequences. Accordingly, the constructivist project rests on a foundational platform of realist assumptions. When coherence push comes to relativistic shove, most philosophers reassert their realist commitments by concluding that truth is something that can transcend what is believed to be the case. there is more to truth than belief because, in important and critical circumstances, truth acts to discipline an incorrect belief, even though truth is never entirely independent of belief. It ought not to be surprising that jurisprudence has followed a similar course and reached a similar point in its development as philosophy generally, cast as a particular corner of the philosophical action. Jurists' efforts to understand law and adjudication have followed those of their more generalist colleagues. While there are still some dyed-in-the-wool philosophical realists around, and there is a flourishing, if contained, revival of axiomatic theories, the predominant approach to legal theory is constructivist. The task of providing a credible and workable account of legal truth and objectivity is achieved by developing the most coherent and compelling account of past legal practice. The most well-known and successful proponent of such an approach is, of course, Ronald Dawkin. The influence of his work has been enormous in academia and, if less so, in the courts. This is not surprising, as he presents his jurisprudential theory as an account of what judges really do as much as what they should do. Moreover, Dawkin's account is explicitly philosophical in orientation and elaboration. Although he offers an account that gives prominence to prevailing views and existing opinions, he insists that there are definite limits on the moral authority of such beliefs. For Dawkin, there are right answers to legal controversies, even if we disagree about what they are, and integrity's writ only runs as far as certain realist moral truths allow. The adjudicative principle of integrity is not absolutely sovereign over what judges must do at the end of the day, because, if a judge's own sense of justice condemned a particular course of action, he would have to consider whether he should actually enforce it, or whether he should lie and say that it was not law after all, or whether he should resign. For Dawkin, therefore, law is an epistemological undertaking of the most demanding and traditional kind. Objectivity and truth are its watchwords and credentials. This minimally scaled-down project retains all the elements of a Blacksonian understanding of scholarly propriety and success. Jurists cannot seem to accept that justification is not about the abstract or special relation between ideas, but is a social practice that is or requires an external authority to its own contextual development. Truth is no different from what passes as true. To insist that there is no distinction between what the world seems like to us and what the world really is not itself offered as a metaphysical truth but as a statement about the current state of play in the social enterprise of understanding the world. Any standards of assessment and validity are not external to and thereby controlling of debate, they are internal to the debate in that they inform it as much as they are changed by it. Epistemology fails in the sense that there is no privileged ground on which knowledge or meaning can claim to stand. From an alternative pragmatic perspective, objectivity is about social agreement, whether imposed or assumed. It is not an approximation to some natural, neutral, or non-contextualized standard of verification. As Richard Rorty deftly puts it, explanatory power is where we find it. Accordingly, theoretical inquiry ought to concern itself less with the truth and objectivity of certain beliefs and more with the moral and practical implications of such beliefs. Again, as Darwin's work showcases, there are no normative consequences that flow from an evolutionary perspective and no particular values are embedded in nature's struggle. Impure thoughts. The whole idea of law working itself pure is anathema to any kind of evolutionary account of law. Even under the most modest and non-systemic account, evolution is most certainly not a purifying process in which deviant forms are eliminated so that a species' true being can assert itself. To suggest that there could be a perfect or essential form of law relies on a misleading understanding of legal development as an entirely intellectual and internal process that is affected by environmental factors in the only the most incidental and uninfluential way. No legal doctrine is or can be ideal and pure. The best that can be hoped for is that doctrines might develop that are successful in the sense that they serve particular purposes, that they adapt to local conditions, and that they have a certain flexibility to remain relevant in a changed environment. However, whether particular rules are good or bad or useful or useless is a local assessment. It is not a once-and-for-all judgment about the rule's universal desirability. Moreover, complexity is not an indicia of something's designed nature. The fact that the common law is a highly complex entity does not mean that it is, therefore, designed. It is not shaped like clay by an invisible hand that is guided by some economic animus or ethical mindset. Furthermore, such a jurisprudential account runs up against the problem that, if law became perfectly adapted to its social and philosophical role, any change in the environment would immediately ensure that law was unsuited and unresponsive to challenges that occurred. Thus, if the idea of law working itself pure is to have any validity or bite, it must rest on a particular theory of social development, that society will also reach a point of political equilibrium in which social tensions are in both philosophical and practical harmony. that is both fantastical and reactionary. Such assumptions place such crypto-creationists in the dubious camp of end-of-history prognosticators like Francis Fukuyama, who maintain that there is a fundamental process at work that dictates a common evolutionary pattern for all human societies. In short, something like a universal history of mankind in the direction of liberal democracy. Contemporary jurisprudence remains in the scholastic shadow of a formalistic need for scientific rigor and abstract detachment, as if this were the key to unlock the normative secrets of the universe. The fact is that there are no normative secrets to the universe to be unlocked that are not the projections of our own ideals and desires. Contemporary jurists continue to waste valuable energies in this hapless pursuit. They have a lingering theological ambition in that they wish to ascend to some superhuman vantage point. What else is Hercules but a mythic and superhuman alter ego of Dawkin himself? For instance, Dawkin wants us to make a justificatory ascent to some abstract Promethean remove from which we can catch an echo of the infinitely true and carry it back to society for people's edification and enlightenment. The more recalcitrant the problem, the higher the ascent. The more entrenched the controversy, the more transcendent the escape, the more convoluted the possibilities, the purer the ambition. However, contrary to the creationist instinct for escape, progress is not about becoming more objective and true, about achieving justificatory height in order to attain moral depth, or advancing toward some higher, more removed, and abstract plane on which rationality holds sway outside of the disabling influences of interests, commitments, fuzziness, history, culture, and ideology. Despite traditional theorists' wishes and work to the contrary, there is no way to escape the politics of human finitude and transmigrate to an infinite realm of pure reason that secures people against the need to make difficult and always contestable choices. Elegance, coherence, and simplicity are valued attributes of any theory, but they are hollow and unattractive as ends in themselves. Accordingly, rather than commune with Mansfield's ghost and his juristic imitators about the common law working itself a pure, it is more instructive to think about judges as engaged, through their own efforts and imagination, in the process of law simply working itself against and within local conditions. There is much to admire in Dawkins and other like-minded jurists' work. They are excellent at parsing moral issues, highlighting ethical quandaries, and, at their best, proposing creative solutions to normative dilemmas. However, this counts for little if it remains in the debilitating shadow of a creationist and Blackstonian mentality that celebrates the ahistorical, abstract, and schematic. It is necessary to abandon the conceit that it is only possible to be theoretical if one escapes the bounds of cultural and social context and seeks to transcend traditions and genres. Instead of being true to an emphasis on situated standards and engaged persuasion, Dawkinian-inspired jurists, and there are many, even if they remain in the naturalist closet, have once again entered on a justificatory ascent toward some superhuman realm where truth, objectivity, and, therefore, authority are the reward of those who best ape the gods. Indeed, the chair of jurisprudence at Oxford University shares much with the bishopric of Oxford. Through Dawkin and Wilberforce, law and religion combine over the years and across the disciplines to share a common ambition. In the Dawkinian Empire, although the noble judges are princes of the legal realm and bear the brunt of applying and transforming the extant law in line with its own purer ambitions, they must leave it to philosophical seers and prophets to work out law's ambitions for itself, the purer form of law within and beyond the law we have. While such work and inspiration may elude rank-and-file lawyers, they are not left to their own devices, for their God is the adjudicative principle of integrity, which is a more dynamic and radical standard than it first seemed, because it encourages a judge to be wide-ranging and imaginative in his search for coherence with fundamental principle. This divinistic rhetoric is not a million miles away from the uplifting, creationist waxings of Soapy Sam. Redeemed man may soar upon the wings of devotion, and rise through the middle sky of simple intellectualism to the purer atmosphere and clearer light of religious service. For instead of resting satisfied with simple intellectual triumphs, he may in each one of these see more of the Creator's glory as he studies his works, and fill his soul with clearer visions of power, and wisdom, and goodness, and love of him who has breathed forth from his own eternal being all the wonders of the created universe. The dubious achievement of such creationist scholarship is that, while Dawkin has obliged most legal scholars to concede that law is about values as much as rules, he has done so in a way that does not disturb the informing black-letter commitment that underpins the mainstream academic enterprise, by presenting the resort to politics as being exclusively armchair philosophizing rather than getting one's hands dirty in the messy world of real-life circumstances. Dawkin has managed to chastise the black-letter tradition of legal scholarship at the same time that he has taken it to more abstract heights. Most dauntingly, This tendency to abstract theorizing is offered as a way to remain a spectator rather than a player in life's theater of action. However, this is a canard, as such an approach is really about being an active player while masquerading as a passive bystander. Once stripped of their philosophical paraphernalia, research juristic theories are revealed as simply another political and partisan intervention. The claim that all that is done in the name of blackletterism, whether doctrinal or theoretical, is done in a technical and non-ideological way is no more convincing today than it ever has been. Under cover of this apparently modest and apolitical intellectualized approach, there is a very real set of substantive biases in play. What is claimed to pass for philosophical rigor in the name of coherence and intelligibility is really a barely disguised effort to maintain and defend a spruced up status quo. In the same way that the immediate popularity and lasting appeal of Blackstone's commentaries owed as much to the ideological leanings of its author as to its intellectual excellence, so the contributions of today's leading scholars to synthesize the law into a comprehensive and systematic body of rules and principles are neither neutral, objective, nor detached. It is not that there is a vast and overt conspiracy in play, but that the naive craft commitments of the mainstream academic community are much less benign than many members recognize. However, the complacent assumption that the law is, by its nature as law, good and that this goodness will be enhanced in proportion to its increasing internal coherence and formal intelligibility wears extremely thin in light of much evidence to the contrary. The camel is no animal for legal academics to emulate, and sand is a poor building material for law schools. As Pierre Schlag concisely puts it, the progressive fallacy is the belief that the aspects of a practice that are good are constitutive or essential to the practice, while those aspects of the practice that are bad are merely byproducts of or contingent to the practice. In short, blackletterism works as a convenient mode of denial. It enables legal academics and lawyers to engage in what is a highly political and contested arena of social life, namely, law, and to pretend that they are doing so in a largely non-ideological way. The main advantage of this is that they can go about their daily routines without assuming any political or personal responsibility for what happens in the legal process. However, the insistence that lawyering is a neutral exercise that does not implicate lawyers in any political process or demand from scholars a commitment to any particular ideology is as weak as it is deceptive. Such a Wilberforce-like image is a profoundly conservative and crude understanding of what it is to engage in the business of courts, legislatures, and the like. It accepts and works within the bounds of the status quo. Lawyers tend to confuse legal justice with social fairness. Indeed, the power and prestige of lawyers flow from their professional allegiance to the state's official laws and existing institutions. In spite of the efforts of many individual lawyers, lawyers as a group are the enlisted custodians of the status quo. By pretending otherwise and renouncing responsibility for the system that their actions hold in place, lawyers and academics are able to maintain their so-called independence and apolitical authority. The black-letter tradition of legal scholarship is in the business of producing political tracts as much as the politician and polemicist. The fact that they are presented and styled in the opaque jargon of professional disinterest and technical expertise serves to compound the disingenuity. As such, blackletterism is an ideology in the profoundest sense of the word, in that it presents a particular and partial view of the world as neutral and natural. Notwithstanding all this, it is clear that there is some level of design in law that is lacking in biology. People do tend to make plans and act on them. After all, law is a reasoned activity in that people reflect on what is best to do and how that might be achieved. Law is not a game of chance, and, one would hope, judges do not play dice. In contrast, biological adaptation is not a conscious or reasoned response to environmental situations. The main force of Darwin's great idea is that organisms adapt as a matter of necessity. Evolution is not planned or premeditated. Or, to put it more sharply, Lamarck has a role in legal development that is not present in biological evolution. However, that role is limited and attenuated. Local intended initiatives take place, but this does not make law an entirely rational process. In the common law, individual judicial initiatives are overwhelmed by a more general, unplanned and aggregating dynamic that is response to external conditions. The whole does not discipline the parts in the way that jurists believe, but tends to direct the parts in a way that is externally explicable, even if not internally rational. While doctrinal patterns and pathways arise, they do not respond to any overarching logic. As in the biological world, accidents and drift play a huge part in legal evolution. It is not all about rational adaptation and designed development. Jurisprudence is and never will be an exact science that determines what can and cannot happen or what should and should not happen. In law, sometimes 1 + 1 = 2, but sometimes 1 plus 1 equals 3. The common law is a work in progress in the most comprehensive and unmitigated sense. There are no unvarying essentials or eternal designs. There are most certainly no moral lessons that can be read mechanically from the bare historical facts of legal evolution. In human affairs, logic and rationality are as much the result of evolution as its generator. Because it is not possible to predict the future, lawyers and jurists are particularly susceptible to seeing the present as an inevitable consequence of the past and then projecting this concept on the move from the present to the future. After all, they say that today is only tomorrow's yesterday. Accordingly, while the common law and its adjudicative performance can be characterized with some credibility as comprising a self-reflective process of reasoned thinking, it is far from reducible to an activity that is governed by a strict philosophical discipline that is entirely internal to legal practice. All the talk about grand purposes or guiding minds is pitched at such a high level of generality that what they might or might not recommend in any particular situation is almost impossible to predict. Or, to turn that around, the solution to any particular problem can be interpreted in accordance with a variety of very different, often competing, and occasionally contradictory ideals that can plausibly claim a purchase on the extant legal materials. Consequently, while law is undeniably a teleological enterprise in that judges act with a purpose, the system as a whole cannot be said to have a directing mind such that it moves forward in one direction as if pulled along toward a given goal. In law, there are many theoretical possibilities, but the actual decision made is as much about external circumstances as anything else. Principles prosper or perish not only by dint of their intellectual merit but also by their capacity to adapt to material conditions. Although Holmes' claims for the relevance of evolutionary theory were misplaced, his warning remains pertinent and ought not to be ignored by those jurists who want to follow in his intellectual footsteps. We have evolution in this sphere of conscious thought and action no less than in lower organic stages, but an evolution which must be studied in its own field. Conclusion. In this chapter, I have sought to show that a major implication of the Darwinian idea is that people breed for reproduction and survival, not for finding deep truths about the universe and themselves. This does not mean that the search for philosophical truths is pointless, only that it is not our purpose or raison d'etre. After all, God is dead. The whole idea of purification, or perfectibility, as biologists prefer to call it, is entirely incompatible with any vaguely Darwinian evolutionary account. It smacks of creationism because it suggests both direction and goal as well as predetermined ends that include the continuing enhancement of what it is to be human. In this way, the limits of any jurisprudential theory might be as much about humanity's limits as reality's recalcitrance, created half to rise, and half to fall, /great lord of all things, yet a prey to all, /sole judge of truth, in and less error hurl ''d, /the glory, jest and riddle of the world. Any study that takes the idea and practice of evolution seriously must be prepared to make the shift from philosophy to history. However, such a historical approach must itself resist the allure of an abstract approach and be prepared to get its hands dirty in the soil of politics. It is counterproductive to depict law as evolutionary and not treat it seriously as a phenomenon that only has meaning in its ever-changing historical shape and substance. Once contingency is accepted, its punishing force corrodes any static conception of law, society, jurisprudence, history, and even politics. In both the science and the humanities, the will to know is frequently accompanied by the will to power. At a minimum, it behooves biological and juristic pundits, like the creationists, to come clean and at least admit that what they are offering is a faith-based doctrine, not a neutral science. To be a wolf is one thing, but to be a wolf in sheep's clothing only compounds the offense. While it might be true that law and legal scholarship, like all stories, are haunted by the ghosts of the stories they might have been, law remains thoroughly spooked by the jurisprudential phantoms of what it could and should never be. A more appropriate response to such jurisprudential fantasizing is not awe-induced toleration but a defiant and decisive act of ghost-busting. The hold of creationism rests on the fear that evolution undercuts all traditional values and suggests that everything is up for grabs. It is somehow assumed that, without values to ground them, people will be lost and adrift. Yet, without fealty to God or other lesser deities, there need be neither chaos nor tyranny. On the contrary, exorcising the ghost of Bishop Wilberforce and his latter-day juristic followers can encourage people to move beyond trepidation and subservience by providing an opportunity for transformation and renewal. An abandonment of the creationist project will not render all knowledge illusory, turn all truths into falsehoods, throw all order into chaos, and reveal all objectivity as sham. This is a ghastly projection of the creationist's imagination and ought to have no more hold on our intellects than Soapy Sam himself. When all is said and done, there are simply people, with all the frailties and possibilities that this entails, trying to make sense of themselves, the contingency of their situation, and the responsibility to make and remake their own lives in the best way that they see fit. But there is no bargain, Faustian or otherwise, that can get us out of the continuing present to some redemptive future or forgiving past. Despite what some hope and maintain, evolutionary theory is not the source of salvation to replace the creationist tradition, because no normative consequences at all flow from evolution's acceptance. It is to those misguided efforts to salvage some ethical guidance from the Darwinian insight and turn Darwin into an avenging moral prophet that I now turn.